Recovered Guild Expedition Report. Status: unresolved. Begin record.
There are many sounds a hunter learns to fear in the wild. The crack of branches beneath something too heavy to see, the grinding breath of a wyvern behind a stone wall, and the sudden rattle of scales moving through grass where no wind is blowing. But the hunters who entered the Rime-Coil Basin discovered something worse than any monstrous roar. They discovered what it meant to hear absolutely nothing. The silence did not arrive gradually. One moment their armor clattered, their boots crushed frost, and their companions shouted warnings across the ravine. The next moment, every sound vanished at once, as though the entire world had been sealed behind thick glass. And when they screamed in confusion, they could not even hear their own voices. Outside the circle, their allies were shouting for them to run. Inside it, the trapped hunters saw mouths moving, but heard no words, no footsteps, and no warning from the enormous serpent sliding closer through the snow. By the time they understood that the silence itself was the trap, the Deafscale Najarala was already coiled around them. The creature was once believed to be an ordinary Najarala, one of the great serpentine monsters known for surrounding prey with resonating scales. A normal Najarala launches these scales into the terrain, then vibrates them with powerful sound waves, creating violent bursts that confuse, injure, and disorient anything caught between them. Hunters fear the noise because it signals that the serpent has already chosen the boundaries of its attack. The Deafscale Najarala evolved in the caverns beneath the Rime-Coil Basin, where tunnels descended so deeply that even echoes seemed to die against the walls. Generations spent hunting in those narrow chambers changed the structure of its scales. Instead of amplifying sound, the altered scales absorbed vibration, smothered echoes, and created pockets where noise could no longer travel. Its hide darkened to the color of wet slate, broken by pale bands along its neck that resembled rows of closed eyes. The large scales covering its back became wider, thinner, and almost hollow, with layered chambers inside them that trapped vibration. When raised, the scales did not rattle like those of its relatives. They opened with a faint movement of air, soft enough to be mistaken for cloth shifting in another room. Most disturbing of all was the way it learned to use them. The Deafscale did not throw scales directly at its prey because the scales were not meant to wound. It launched them in a wide ring around a chosen target, forming a soundproof circle that could turn a crowded battlefield into a private hunting chamber. The first official expedition into Rime-Coil Basin consisted of 6 hunters, 2 researchers, and a supply handler named Mara Ven. The guild had received reports of missing miners, abandoned camps, and livestock found crushed without any nearby tracks. Survivors from the outer settlements spoke of brief periods when the forest became strangely quiet, but the guild dismissed those accounts as panic caused by an unfamiliar monster. The expedition entered the basin shortly before dawn, following a frozen river between cliffs of black stone. Wind passed constantly through the ravine, producing a low moan that echoed for miles, and the hunters joked that nothing could approach without being heard. Even the smallest movements were loud there, from loose chains striking armor to frost breaking beneath their boots. Their leader, Garen Holt, found the first scale embedded in the riverbank. It was nearly as long as his forearm, curved like a thin shield, and covered in shallow ridges that seemed to drink in the morning light. When he struck it with the handle of his knife, he felt the impact travel through his fingers, but the scale produced no audible note. Researcher Elia Marr wrapped the scale in cloth and placed it inside a storage case. She suggested that the material might have grown unusually dense because of the cold, although she could not explain why the impact had been silent. Garen ordered the group to continue, and no one noticed the long groove in the snow above them, where something enormous had recently crossed the ridge. Near midday, they reached the remains of a mining station built against the cliff. The doors were open, tools lay scattered across the yard, and a cooking pot still rested over a bed of dead ash. There were no bodies in the camp, but blood had dried in several long streaks that led toward a collapsed tunnel. Mara found a message scratched into the wooden floor of the storage shed. The words were shallow and uneven, as though carved by someone whose hands would not stop shaking. It read, "When it goes quiet, look behind you." The group had little time to consider the warning before a series of impacts struck the snow around the station. Large scales dropped from above, burying their tips in the ground and forming a rough circle around 3 hunters near the tunnel entrance. Garen shouted for everyone to take cover, but halfway through his command, his voice disappeared. Mara stood only a few steps outside the circle. She could hear Garen and the researchers behind her, the wind rushing between the buildings and the nervous snorting of the pack animals. The 3 hunters inside the ring could hear none of it. At first, they looked merely confused. One tapped the side of his helmet, while another opened his mouth and shouted a question that reached Mara as a muffled breath. The 3rd hunter struck his shield with his sword, producing a visible shower of sparks, but no sound inside the barrier. Mara called to them, telling them to move away from the scales. The trapped hunters stared at her moving lips and answered with louder shouts, unable to judge the strength of their own voices. Their screams became strained and desperate. But to them, even those screams existed only as pressure in the throat and vibration in the skull. Garen threw a stone into the circle. It landed between the hunters and kicked up a burst of snow, yet none of them turned toward the impact. The barrier did not simply block sound from entering. It swallowed every noise created inside it, including the warning signs of anything moving across the ground. That was when Mara saw the snow behind them begin to rise. A long ridge pushed forward beneath the white surface, circling slowly around the trapped hunters. Outside the barrier, the movement produced a heavy scraping sound, but inside the circle, the 3 victims continued watching their allies, never realizing that the Deafscale Najarala had already entered the ring. Its head emerged behind the nearest hunter. The serpent lifted without a roar, its jaws opening so close to the man's shoulder that its breath disturbed the fur lining of his armor. Mara screamed and pointed, but her warning struck the barrier and died less than an arm's length from him. The hunter saw her expression change. He turned just as the Najarala lunged, and the serpent's jaws closed around his upper body. His companions saw his legs leave the ground, but they heard no impact, no cracking armor, and no scream when the monster dragged him backward into the snow. Panic shattered what remained of their formation. One hunter ran toward the edge of the circle and struck an embedded scale with his hammer, while the other spun wildly, searching for the serpent. The scale bent under the hammer but made no sound, and the lack of impact confused the hunter so severely that he looked down at his weapon as though it had passed through empty air. The Deafscale moved beneath them again. Snow shifted around their boots, but without the scrape of scales or the rumble of displaced earth, the movement appeared disconnected from any source. The second hunter fired his bowgun at the ground, and although the muzzle flashed brightly, the silent recoil caused him to stumble in terror. Outside the ring, Garen ordered the group to destroy the scales. They attacked from every side, striking the embedded plates with blades, hammers, and explosive charges. Sound returned briefly whenever one scale cracked, but the remaining scales absorbed the noise and restored the barrier before the trapped hunters could understand the shouted commands. The last hunter inside the circle reached the edge and pressed both hands against an embedded scale. Mara stood directly opposite him, close enough to see his eyes through the visor of his helmet. He shouted something she could not hear while she screamed for him to climb over the scale and keep running. The snow behind him opened. The Deafscale's body rose in a silent curve, higher than the roof of the mining station, and began closing around the interior of the ring. Mara watched the hunter's expression change as a shadow passed over him, but he did not turn until the serpent's coils touched the backs of his legs. The circle collapsed inward. The Najarala wrapped both surviving hunters in a single crushing coil and pulled them beneath its armored body. Those outside heard bones breaking and metal folding, but the victims themselves heard nothing, not even the destruction of their own armor. Garen shattered the final scale with an explosive barrel, and sound rushed back into the circle with enough force to make everyone stagger. The serpent recoiled, releasing one hunter who was still alive, then vanished through the collapsed tunnel before the group could organize a pursuit. The silence ended, but the survivor continued screaming as though he remained trapped inside it. His name was Olin Vale, a veteran who had hunted monsters for more than 12 years. He could not hear Garen questioning him, and when Elia touched his shoulder, he attacked her in panic. Blood ran from both of his ears, although the Deafscale had never struck his head. The expedition retreated into the mining station and blocked the doors. Olan sat against the far wall, whispering continuously and pressing his palms over his ears. Mara later realized that he was repeating the same sentence. It was touching me before I knew it was there. Night fell quickly in the basin. Wind battered the station, wooden beams groaned beneath the cold, and the survivors listened for any sign of the serpent outside. They expected scraping scales, resonating plates, or the deep bellow common to other Najarala. But the Deafscale gave them nothing to follow. A scale pierced the wall shortly after midnight. It passed between two support beams and buried itself in the floor, silent except for the splintering wood around it. Another entered through the roof, followed by a third that struck the doorway and remained standing upright. The survivors understood what was happening. The monster was not trying to break into the station. It was building another circle around it. Garan ordered everyone to evacuate through the collapsed mine tunnel. The group moved quickly, carrying Olan between them while scales continued to fall outside. With each new scale, the sounds of the storm became weaker, as though the station were sinking beneath deep water. They entered the tunnel moments before the circle sealed. The wind vanished first, followed by the creaking walls and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. Their footsteps remained audible for several seconds, then faded until 8 people were running through darkness without hearing a single boot strike the ground. Mara felt her heartbeat pounding in her neck, but even that seemed strangely distant. She shouted for Garan and felt the effort tear at her throat, yet no voice returned to her ears. Ahead of her, lanterns swung through the tunnel while shadows moved between the beams. The group tried to stay together by holding the belts and straps of the person in front of them. Without sound, however, their pace became uneven. One person would stop while another continued forward, causing the line to stretch, collide, and separate in the narrow passage. Elia began counting aloud to control her breathing. She could feel her mouth shaping the numbers, but the missing sound convinced her that she had stopped breathing entirely. Her panic grew until she was gasping, unable to hear whether air was entering her lungs. Behind them, the Deafscale entered the tunnel. Its body filled most of the passage, sliding over stone and broken rails with a force that should have shaken the entire mine. The survivors felt faint vibrations through the floor, but without sound, they could not tell whether the source was distant or directly beneath them. Garan reached a junction and signaled for the others to turn left. Mara saw the movement and followed, but Olan broke from the group and continued straight ahead. He had seen something in the darkness behind them, something large enough to block the faint light from the station. Mara ran after him. She caught his arm and tried to pull him toward the others, but Olan fought her, pointing frantically down the tunnel. His mouth opened in a scream that neither of them could hear, and over his shoulder, 2 pale bands rose slowly from the darkness. The Deafscale was close enough to touch them. Its head moved forward without a hiss, a growl, or the scrape of its jaws against the tunnel wall. Mara saw its tongue flick through the air, and the complete absence of sound made the movement feel unreal, like an image projected into the darkness. She pushed Olan aside as the serpent struck. Its fangs closed where his chest had been, throwing sparks against the stone. Mara felt the impact through the floor, but the jaws produced no sound at all. Olan ran toward the junction, and Mara followed. The serpent pursued them without haste, because it did not need speed inside the barrier. Every time its body moved, it pushed air through the tunnel, and that pressure was the only warning they received before its head appeared beside them again. At the junction, the others were waiting. Garen hurled an explosive charge past Mara, but when it detonated, there was only a flash and a wave of heat. The silent explosion illuminated the entire tunnel, revealing that the Deafscale's coils had already surrounded the group through cracks in the walls. They had not been escaping through an open passage. They had been moving deeper into the shape of the serpent. The coils tightened, breaking supports and forcing stone from the ceiling. Beams snapped without noise, lanterns shattered without a crash, and the survivors were knocked from their feet by debris they could not hear falling. In that moment, sight became as unreliable as sound, because dust filled the tunnel and erased everything beyond the reach of their hands. Mara crawled blindly until someone grabbed her wrist. She assumed it was Garen and allowed herself to be pulled forward. Then the grip tightened, not like a hand, but like the tip of a muscular tail curling around her arm. She struck it with her knife. The blade cut between scales, and dark blood sprayed across her face. The Deafscale released her, but she had no idea whether it had recoiled in pain or was preparing another attack. Olan appeared through the dust and dragged her into a narrow drainage shaft. Garen and Elia followed, along with the remaining researcher and one wounded hunter. The others disappeared into the dust behind them, their final moments hidden within a silence so complete that no one knew exactly when they died. The drainage shaft ended at an iron grate overlooking the frozen river. Garen kicked the grate repeatedly, but without the sound of bending metal, he could not judge whether it was weakening. The serpent's shadow filled the shaft behind them, moving closer with the calm certainty of something that knew its prey had nowhere left to go. Mara remembered the collected scale in Elia's storage case. She pulled it free, placed it against the locking bar, and ordered Garen to strike it. He brought his hammer down, and the impact sent a violent vibration through the metal, even though the sound remained trapped. The stolen scale cracked. For one brief second, the silence weakened, and the survivors heard the Deafscale directly behind them. It was not roaring or hissing. It was breathing slowly, its jaws already open. Garen struck the scale again. It shattered, releasing every vibration it had absorbed since the riverbank in a single concussive burst. The iron grate tore free, and the survivors were thrown onto the frozen river as sound returned in a flood of cracking ice, screaming wind, and human voices. The Deafscale recoiled into the shaft. Garen detonated the remaining charges, collapsing the tunnel entrance beneath tons of stone. No one believed the collapse had killed the monster, but daylight was spreading across the basin, and the surviving hunters fled before the serpent could rebuild its circle. Only 5 members of the expedition returned to the guild. Olan's hearing came back after 19 days, although certain sounds remained permanently distorted, and he could no longer sleep in a quiet room. Mara recovered most of her hearing after several weeks, but silence caused violent panic attacks for the rest of her life. The guild classified the creature as the Deafscale Najarala and placed the entire Rimecoil Basin under permanent restriction. Later expeditions found broken scales near the collapsed mine, along with long tracks leading north into inhabited territory. No body was ever recovered, and no evidence suggested that the serpent had died. Hunters stationed near the basin now carry bells attached to their armor. The bells are not meant to frighten monsters or guide allies through the snow. They serve as a warning that can be understood instantly. When every bell stops ringing at the same time, the hunters know that something has already drawn a circle around them. A roaring monster tells you where it is. A charging beast gives you the sound of approaching footsteps, breaking branches, and desperate seconds in which to react. The Deafscale Najarala gives you nothing except the sight of your allies screaming warnings you will never hear, while its coils slide closer through a world that has forgotten how to make noise. So when the forest becomes quiet, do not call out to test your voice. Do not wait for the serpent to reveal itself, and do not assume the silence means you are alone. Look for the scales, break the circle, and run before the thing behind you gets close enough to touch.
This report remains under investigation. The Guild closed this case. The archives did not.